Welcome back, everyone. This is part 2 of When Organic Makes the Grade. However, I'm actually going to start with a seemingly unrelated subject, and that has to do with aid, and particularly aid in Africa, as I was born and raised in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, but actually back when it was called Zaire. So that's what I'm familiar with, and I wanted to give you a kind of picture of the country, because I think most people have no concept of how places can be so different than they are here. So one of the poorest countries, if not the poorest country in the world, we're talking a GDP per capita somewhere around $400. So that's making an average person makes $400 a year. It's had a long history of abuse by colonialists, and then more present history, after the genocide in Rwanda, where the Hutus were massacring the Tutsis, the conflict got pushed into northern Congo there, and eventually the conflict just got more and more complicated till basically the Africa's own world war was fought there. And so just to give you very briefly an idea, I mean, over 10 million people, probably double like what the Holocaust was. People have died in the last 10 years or so. Displaced people far outnumbers like the amount in Syria. So you get the idea. It's a place of just a crisis, right? I mean, and all the systems have come to a halt, right? A total failed state. As for the individual, I mean, those people are amazingly resilient, and we're talking people that can come up and make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, as they say, 5 times a day, they drum up enough money or enough commerce or something just to get some food for the day. So at that level, they're amazingly resilient and amazingly creative, and they figure out how to come up with something out of nothing. But the systems above that, the more like, for instance, even back 20, 30 years ago when I was there, the roads were basically left over from the colonialists. The infrastructure for water and for electricity, same thing. I grew up in a sort of an overgrown city, but part of it had some of the municipalities still intact. But we would get electricity and the water would come on at the same time, maybe once a month for a few hours if we were lucky. So you get an idea that, the systems really had ground to a halt, and many of the roads and the highways have just basically devolved into just a mud track, that you certainly couldn't travel between cities without a serious 4-wheel drive. So in this context, you have these crises, and then you have oftentimes you have famine, and at times these situations, they reach the Western media, and you get enough people, to notice. And, there's been times when whether it was Zimbabwe or Ethiopia was a big one, right? And then you get some people, maybe some celebrities, and you get some musicians, famous musicians, and they want to do something. Then they have a concert, right? They get together, they sing "We Are the World," they raise millions of dollars of money, and they decide, we're going to go in there, we're going to help these people. So they might, and maybe this is a place, where the infrastructure has fallen apart. The roads are hard to get into, so you got to maybe airlift the food in there, and it's crazy expensive. And, but say they get together and they do all the logistics, and they airdrop, all this rice and all this maybe powdered milk and cans of this and whatnot. And maybe they even do a good job of setting up sort of a UN distribution, and, and they drop maybe enough food for, let's say, 5 months for 20,000 people in this area that's really hurting, and you accomplish that, and you set up a system of distribution, and, even the best case scenario here, and people are actually going to get divvied out, a little bit of food for the full 5 months, and then you pat yourself on the back and you go home and you say, hey, we did a great job. But the reality is just a lot darker, right? So most of the times this may have been caused by a drought or something, right? So you didn't have rain. And by the time the news has gotten out, by the time you've done your concert, by the time you've gotten all your logistics done and actually, airdropped all this food, well, the rains very likely have come back, right? And so the farmers in that area probably have already planted seed, and their food's all getting together. Maybe they even started selling a little bit of food to people, but obviously it wasn't enough. There's still a crisis, right? And then suddenly you have airdropped enough food for 5 months for 20,000 people or whatever it is, and imagine what that happens to the farmer, right? So those farmers that had just getting ready to sell their stuff at a very tiny price, even if they're just charging 25 cents for something, if you can go get your daily allocated amount of rice from the UN distribution point, you're not going to buy it from the farmer, even if it is a very reasonable price. So you've basically essentially flooded that whole market. And the systems and the infrastructures that were there are completely imploded, right? Another example of this would be, I have family still in the DRC, and they're part of this organization that's trying to reconstruct some of the healthcare system that used to be there, right? And this is a very, very difficult thing to do, because aid is very hard to do without causing harm. And so maybe they find a place where there used to be a hospital or a clinic, and there's a building there, and they said, well, okay, maybe we can help fix this building up again, patch, leaks in the roof, whatnot. And then it's this whole sort of infrastructure you have to build up to it. Say, oh, this is a good location, right? But then maybe we need to have an agricultural project, related to it, so it can make a little bit money on the side, as well as maybe, feed the people that are coming to the hospital, because it's not like here where, you go to the hospital and then you're away from your home. You can just go down the street and get something from fast food or something, or, we're talking about mud huts, dirt roads, people travel. Maybe they've walked or bicycled for 10 miles, 20 miles, they get to the hospital. Who's going to feed them, So you have to think about that area. You have to think about, you're going to have to staff these hospitals with, nurses and doctors, and maybe you even have a educational, medical school kind of thing. But you're going to hire these, you're going to hire the staff, and you have to figure out what's an appropriate amount of pay for these guys. So maybe you pay these guys, let's say $5 a day. Really don't know, but that would be a fantastic job, right? If you take into consideration that most, the average person making $400 a day, well, $5 a day, that's maybe that's an appropriate amount to pay someone. And then it would be worth for them to, to take the years of education to go through medical school and then help out, Maybe you have to work on infrastructure of roads. Maybe you'll have to figure out, how to get some water and all sorts of issues. You're building this whole sort of ecosystem of infrastructure and systems that have to all kind of interrelate to each other and be able to grow, and slowly begin to fill those needs, but in an appropriate way. You would definitely, the hospital would have to charge something for the, if you go see the doctor or for surgery, whatever, but it might have to be really subsidized, so it may be for, a procedure, you have to pay $1 or $2, whatever people can afford, but there has to be some sort of economy that begins to be developed there. Well, the same kind of thing will happen. Maybe there's a crisis in an area again, and suddenly you realize that all these people maybe they've they're catching tuberculosis or whatnot. People don't get attention for that. Maybe it was cholera or something, or polio. And, something big catches the attention again of the Western media. Suddenly there's an NGO that says, we got to go in there and do something. These people really want to help. They're motivated. They get their NGO. They raise their millions and millions of dollars. They go into this area and they set up, here we are. We're going to come here and we're going to got this epidemic and this crisis going. We're going to set up a quick clinic here, and then we're going to give our aid for free, right? So they go and they're there for 5 months. Again, they see 20,000 people, whatever the number is. It's a huge number, right? And they come in there and they want to hire local people to, maybe to be chauffeurs or maybe to whatever. And they're paying people, to them, these people are, have been making maybe 6-figure salaries all their lives, and here they're going to hire someone. They want to help out the local people. So maybe they pay them $100 a day, right? Even the staff at the other clinics, right? They going to say, hey, come on over. We need more people to help us out. We're going to support the local people. So they say, hey, you come over here. We'll pay you $100 a day, right? Well, anyone who was making $5 a day at this other clinic is going to go over and help out for 4 or 5 months to do, at $100 a day, right? And then they're going to give free aid to everybody. So nobody's going to go to the old clinic, even if it's $1 for the procedure, and if they can get whatever they need to get for free from this NGO. So I'm kind of throwing out figures, and who knows how exact or right they are, but you get the idea that, they come in with these millions and millions of dollars. They implode the economy there. So they put these inputs in there, and they just, they're just so inappropriate of scale towards, what the people make there. So then, you're going to feel great and you're going to help all these people out. And maybe you gave free care to tens of thousands of people for several months. And maybe you got the cholera, or polio, epidemic under control. And, but you have just poured millions and millions of dollars into this area that was, people were making $400 a year, right? I mean, there's the issue of scale, and this is going to implode an economy that's really suffering. But any inappropriate scale would actually implode any economy, no matter how robust it is. It's just a matter of scale. So just to give you an idea, right? I mean, just to do the thought experiment, imagine, some aliens come from Neptune, and they come down, and let's go to, somewhere in California or New York City, right? Someplace where, financial, robust economy. But let's say these guys come in and they're, these aliens, they want to, maybe they're even benevolent and they want to help out, and say they were giving, every day they were giving people $10 million. Right? You just show up and you help them collect soil samples that they want to go study and take back to Neptune, whatever. Who knows what they're doing? But, right? And they're dropping $10 million to anybody who's helping them, whatever. Right? Everybody and their cousin and their cousin's girlfriend and boyfriend are going to travel as fast as they can to New York, and they want to get, in, because every day they're there, they're going to make $10 million, right? And not only is this going to cause all sorts of chaos, but it's also all the systems that were there in that local economy, they, because of that implosion, they're just going to come to a grinding halt, because suddenly $10 million every day in the economy, you've just think the thought experiment can go quite far, but I think you get the idea. So aid has always been a very, very difficult thing. And in most cases, we actually do quite a bit more harm in the long term. We might help in the short term, but in the long term, we've never really, it's usually quite detrimental to the long-term systems that be. And to help is actually really tough, and to give appropriate aid, and to know it takes very fine-tuned, cultural, you got to have people who know the culture there, who have, a lot of relationships with the people there, and to build things appropriately with, if you're going to try to put some extra inputs into that kind of economy, and to grow it up appropriately so things don't implode or explode. It's very difficult. But what does this have to do with vegetable growing? Well, this has to do with the second challenge in that there's kind of, it's the difference between an open system and a closed system, right? And I'm using those terms quite loosely. But when you have a rotationally grazed pasture, it's somewhat of a closed system. Of course, you've got the constant sunlight coming in and photosynthesis going on, and the pasture and the perennial and the permaculture crop is gathering that. But then you put your ruminants on top, and the ruminants are eating the grass. But of course, they have that feedback loop of their manure and their urine going back into the soil and helping the plants. And there's this closed feedback loop. And so, of course, there needs to be a third component, whether it's a predator on top of that is keeping the population in check and keeping them moving or whatnot. Or, in our case, it's the farmer, right? And so you keep the system with enough feedback loops intact. There's an extreme amount of abundance that you take off the top of that in order to keep those systems healthy. So that's a relatively closed system. So more of an open system, that's where like vegetables and grain fall in, right? So you say you're growing your tomatoes, your beans, your cucumbers, all that, right? You gave your 2 bushels and your 3 bushels or whatever of tomatoes and okra or whatever, and you give that to your customers. Well, all that nutrition that it really does go to the fruit, the majority of the nutrition that you've gotten from the soil is going into the fruit, and then you give it and you sell it to your customers and your humans. And of course, in terms of relating back to my 4th podcast, humans are a dead end nutritionally, right? Their feedback loop is not involved there. So the manure is not going to go back and help the plants, right? And so if you've taken all these tomatoes or all these beans or whatever, even if you took all the stems, you took all the leaves and you maybe worked them back into the soil, there's just not going to be enough nutrients to replenish what was taken up and taken out and sold off to the customers. So that sort of open system that doesn't have the feedback loop of fertility is going to require inputs. And this is how it's related to aid, because inputs can be done well, or they can cause a lot of damage, much like aid. And so probably, what would happen, we used to, you want to either start a garden or even if you want to start a big farm, right? But we used to take the arable land and you take your lawn, or in the case you take pasture, and you, whatever scale it is, right? You plow up that grass in the pasture, whether it's, a 1/4 acre or 1,000 acres, right? You take that perennial pasture and you plow it up, and then you start planting all these plants, whether it's grain or vegetables, right? And it might go great for a year or two, but then you're going to quickly see that, okay, now we're struggling with pest issues, or we're struggling with, some diseases, or we're struggling with, and a lot of times that has to do with just lack of nutrition that the plant's able to. It's just not quite as resilient. So the typical paradigm of doing this is to test, right? So you get your extension agent and they test and you look for deficiencies and then you supplement, right? So let's say you got the test back and boy, you're pretty low in potash and and you might need some magnesium or whatever, but hey, let's get this into there. And the classic thing is to get some chemical fertilizer, right? All the, the most common is like 10-10-10. And, you very likely are going to be, well, here you need some potash and maybe phosphorus, but, hey, there's no problem. Give it also some extra nitrogen. Your plant's going to love it. And so you give your fertilizer, whatever it is, right? And your plants are going to respond to that because these have been made in the lab in a way that's very accessible for the plants. And they green up and they fruit up and they give this great crop. And you're like, dang, this is awesome. This is great. This is the way to go, right? But you've basically done the same thing at a point of crisis, you've come in and you've imploded the economy, but you've taken care of a whole lot of plants and a whole, just like the people came in and they fed the 20,000 people for 5 months, or they were able to give free health care for it, right? But all the little local, I've been spent a lot of time trying to talk about the soil and the ecological and all these little different economies going on and all these little systems interacting with each other. Well, these huge, powerful, strong chemical fertilizers are basically the alien coming in and giving $10 million a day to everyone they see, right? And it implodes the economies of the soil. So, and they've done studies, particularly with phosphorus, and this relates back to what I was talking about with the mycorrhizal. And remember that one of the things of sequestering carbon is that they're trading nutrients for the carbon, and in particular phosphorus is one of those ones that the plant is able to get from the fungus and then trades the carbon for it. Well, if there's all this free phosphorus or free whatever just sitting around the soil and it's really accessible for the plant, they don't make the symbiotic relationships with the mycorrhizal. And so that plant may have the nutrients it needs for that season or even, however long, but that's going to be just short term. And it's guaranteeing this sort of dependence on these chemical fertilizers. Just like aid, most of the time, what it's doing is really good at creating dependence and not helping people become self-sustaining or, get their own feet under them. And the same thing happens with the plants. So I would say that, my last podcast talked about erosion and tilling the soil and losing our soil. There's one thing, lose your physical soil, that has got to be, number one on the list of things that will destroy our ecology, right? If you lose your soil, you don't even have anything to work with. But very likely this close second would be the chemical fertilizers coming in, because your soil may still be there, but you've basically imploded all the local systems and the local, ecological systems underneath. They end up grinding to a halt. And so then you become dependent on these, basically oil-based chemicals in order to keep your plants going. And they become less and less nutritionally dense, simply because you can't, you're basically giving your macronutrients. For people, if we have fat and protein and carbohydrates. For plants, as a very loose parallel, you have your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, right? But we all know that nutrition is so much more involved than just the macronutrients. So chemical fertilizers as inputs are extraordinarily destructive in the long term, even if they give you a really good crop at first. So what are some alternatives? Well, I have some good friends next door, and they half it's got two operations on their farm. One runs a CSA, but the other part of it is they have a warehouse for organic supplements. Some of it's for animals too, but most of it's for organic vegetable growing. And I have seen pallets and pallets of the stuff called Harmony that people come, and it's certified organic fertilizer, and it's from chicken manure, right? And so it's a source that's not from the lab, right? It's not chemical in that sense. It's from a biological animal, so it's organic in that sense. But the reality is that while it does great things for the soil and whatnot, but these are coming from the CAFOs, right? The confinement animal feeding operations, right? These come from those warehouses with the tens and tens of thousands of chickens in them. And, if you're in that system and you've got, 50,000 chickens in a warehouse and they're all pooping, you got to do something with all that manure, right? And so this, from that perspective is a great way to take that manure. And, I think you gotta collect it. You gotta ship it off to some sort of place that's gonna process it. I guess I should know this better, but I imagine they heat it up or do some sort of something to make sure that it's safe and it doesn't have any more chemicals in it, whatever. Then they dry it, and then they package it in like 50-pound bags, and then they ship it off to a distribution center, and then that gets spread out to everywhere, and then eventually it gets to these organic farms. So while it's a great way to mitigate the waste from these big chicken warehouses, it's very heavily oil dependent, on the transportation and the processing and whatnot. And so, and it's a little bit of a mitigation. It's a step in the right direction, but there's some irony there that so it's an organically certified product to fertilize all these organic farms, but it actually only 25% of it comes or is required to come from even warehouses that feed organic food. So we're really very connected. The Harmony and that kind of stuff is very connected to the industrial factory farming, and even the parts of it that are organic or are feeding organic in these big warehouses. Only 25% of the Harmony is required to have that. So while it's a step in the right direction, it's not quite as much of an implosion as the chemical would be. You're still very much tied into the factory farm whole system and everything. And so what would be some other alternatives? I have some other friends that they run a big organic vegetable farm, and they were very savvy in that when they set up their operation, they located just outside of just kind of on the outskirts of the town, and they have this set up, and I'm not sure exactly the details, but they have to set up with the municipalities that they get truckloads of the leaves that are collected, and they also get a certain percentage of like wood chips and whatnot from trees. And you go to their farm, and you've got hills, like they've come in by the dump truckloads, and you see these the wood chips and these mountains of wood chips. And this is a fantastic source of inputs. That they probably have half a dozen ways to work these back into the soil, whether it's compost or mulch, or who knows. I know all the different ways you would get that back in the soil, but this is massive amounts of inputs readily available in order to eventually work their way into the soil, hopefully even sequestering carbon, because a lot of this is carbon based, and making their soils better as they go. A fantastic model, obviously not one that everyone can do, but these are the kind of things you really need to think about when you're going to raise vegetables. Is how do you have a sustainable source of inputs that are not harmful, like chemicals, and organic, and fundamentally good, clean, and organic sourced inputs. So however, I would go even a step further, and the same farm here that does inputs, they have some animals, but I think that to really truly be regenerative, I think animals need to be part of the picture. And I do know of some people who are even raising grain, that they'll have, a field of grain, and then they may plant their cover crop. And instead of, getting out there and turning that cover crop back into the soil, they're going to send their ruminants over, and the ruminants are going to eat that cover crop. And so that accomplishes both things, the part one and part two of you've got the animals going in there, and they're doing exactly what Roundup would do, right? They're going to eat all the foliage, and if you can get some even sheep there, they can even get further down and eat all the way down. You're going to clean up that whole area. And instead of using chemicals to poison all the foliage, basically you've done that through animals. And at the same time as they're going through there, they're giving inputs, right? Because it's going to go right through their system, and they're going to drop their manure, and they're going to drop their urine back into the soil there. So I think that to truly get to a regenerative place, these systems, I think that more and more vegetable farms and grain farmers are going to have to incorporate some sort of rotational grazing into their system so that you can get more feedback loops involved there, so that your soil would actually, over the long term, keep systems going and fertility growing there. So I wanted to also move on and address one more thing. I finally feel like I've now have the context where I can address the non-ruminants on our farm. So we have people who criticize our non-ruminants, and it's fair criticism. It's things you have to think about. And one of the things that people say, we rotate our hogs, and they get a good percentage of their intake is going to be pasture, but that realistically, we're talking quarter to maybe some people argue can go up to a third of their intake being pasture. I'm not quite sure it's that high. And it'd be very hard to know exactly how much, but, right. You still have that, let's say you still have the other 3/4 that's of inputs, and that's grain. And there is a very valid criticism that, when you have these grain dependent, breeds and animals that are out in the field, that, that's an input, and it's, it can be costly to the environment when you know enough about how grain is grown and whatnot. And so this is something that we definitely have thought about, and we are actually working on sourcing our grain more and more sustainable, more local sources, and hopefully to get a podcast later on that. But suddenly, I definitely get that criticism of inputs. I would argue that yes, I'm trying to source my inputs really well, and I'm putting them through a system where actually then it goes through the hog, and then the manure and the urine falls back onto the pasture, and that's a very appropriate. It's a great feedback loop, and it's a very appropriate input for the economies and the local systems of the soil right there. So part of it is I get the criticisms, but I feel like oftentimes I get them from vegetable growers, and for me that's kind of an irony, because I feel like their systems always require inputs. And then we get the criticism that our animals are requiring some inputs, and so suddenly, if we can see that most of the time we're getting inputs, whether you're a vegetable or if you're a hog farmer or whatnot, and it's just when are these inputs appropriate? What kind of inputs are there, and what kind of feedback loops, and how are we getting these inputs to basically interrelate with the soil and the ecosystems that are around there? And the second criticism comes, and this would lead me to our broilers. So we raise the Cornish cross, and they're a hybrid, and they're a really production model bird. And we've spent years getting better and better at having them be able to be rotationally grazed. Call it grazing. Again, same thing. We're hoping to get maybe a quarter of their intake to be pasture, right? But we move these guys every day. And they have the inputs, right? But another criticism on top of that is that they are, they're very large, right? So these birds, we're not quite can't do it quite as fast as when they do them in the industries inside the warehouses. But in 7 weeks, we can get an averaging about 4.5 pound carcass of these birds. It's amazing. They grow incredibly fast. So we really feel like we found a good, in a sense, compromise, right? So we need to make some money, and if you go with any of the heritage breeds, it's going to take forever to grow them out. And even if you go with some of the other hybrids that are not quite as production oriented, the K22s or the Freedom Rangers, these are breeds of chickens that are a little less fast, and they're hoping they can forage a little more. Well, these still take not quite twice as long, but maybe 1.5 times as long, and we just can't get as many rounds in. But we're getting enough grass in them that their nutrition is changing, their taste is changing, and they're tasting just as good as any of these Freedom Rangers going. And that has a lot to do with how much work we do in order to get them fresh grass and whatnot. But the criticism remains that here they are. They're a bird that grows 10 times faster than their original wild counterparts. And, they're still going about 2 to 3 times faster than the regular heritage breeds that we had. And that's, when you're talking about genetics, there are some valid criticism there that if we've got, like 95% of the chickens raised for meat are now this one kind of genetic, if something were to go through them, that's, again, that's not a diversity. It's not a diversity of genetics to be resilient there. And I get it. In this case, I have to compromise some because I have to make some money. I have to make enough money to keep going here. But I get that criticism. But again, as my wife Sarah will say, people say, I can't believe this is a bird. It's huge. It's it's 5 times the heritage breed size or 3 times or whatever it is, and she'll say, well, that's true. But when have you ever eaten a vegetable that wasn't 10 times, 20 times the size of its wild counterpart? Right? So same, we don't ever get these kinds of critical thought and processes, not ever, but rarely against the vegetables, right? But I want a carrot that's actually big enough for me to eat. I mean, if you go to Queen Anne's lace and pull up the root there, that's the wild carrot. It's sure tastes vaguely like carrot, but you're basically eating these like fiber sticks, right? I'm very happy for a big fat carrot bigger than, my fingers and chomp into them and whatnot. And so again, I get these criticisms but I feel like if we can keep them in the context of the ecosystems of our soils and the ecology of what's going on, we're able to use these inputs very, very positively. So, I think I talked about a field that we had gotten, and it had horse pasture for, had been continuously grazed by horses for a long time. This was a pasture that had was coming, all the systems were just coming to a halt, right? And there was even bare parts of the earth, and they were starting to spread some. And when we first got the horses off, boom. And then I just thought I'd let it grow for a bit, and just hardly anything grew. The systems had just kind of ground to a halt. Well, if you're going to stick ruminants through there, you would hardly get enough. It has to be a certain amount of biomass that you can get to the ruminants to make it worth it for them to be on there. And that just wasn't really feasible for the kind of the numbers that we had. So I felt like I couldn't even get my sheep on there. So what I did was I put chickens and ducks, and I rotated them, and I was putting inputs through them. So not only there was enough grass, and it was short enough, it was a good size and short enough for the poultry there to be able to eat, I like it a good bit taller for the sheep, but for the poultry it was a good size. I'm giving the inputs of the grain, yes, that I brought in from outside the farm, but those were going into my soil. And so I was starting to condition this pasture. So I sent the poultry through a couple times, and then suddenly there was enough inputs there for the grass to start growing again. And there's nothing that'll green up your pasture like sending broilers through and they just dump a whole load of manure. And you just keep that moving on down, and you just have this swath of green that follows behind them. Well, once I was able to do that and I was able to get enough biomass, then I could run in and I could bring in my ruminants behind them. And a lot of times, typically people are thinking, send your ruminants and then send your chickens in. But I just did this opposite way because of the amount of inputs that my poultry were allowed to be putting into the soil. Growing enough grass, get enough biomass there, and then suddenly you're putting the ruminants behind. And then we've been conditioning that field to the point where that field may very well be the most fertile. Like in 5-6 years, we've taken it from just about ground to a halt to extremely fertile, giving an unbelievable amount of biomass. So again, that's scale. That has to do with appropriate amount of inputs, appropriate kind of inputs, and being able to do them in ways that are supporting the systems that exist there. So same sort of principles that you would apply to helping, poor people in a crisis in some place as poor and as a failed state like the Congo. Same thing has to apply with our soils. And there's, every soil and every situation is going to be a little different, but it's really, we have to be very mindful of how we go in there and deal with our inputs and deal with how we can support and grow these systems. Because for me, it's all about making all these systems better and making them for the long term as well. All right. I think I'm going to wrap it up with that. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you later.